Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We want to get started on time. I'm particularly interested in tonight's message and the title, Christmas, because there is a hymn that we often sing only at Christmas time, and I just absolutely love it, and I think we ought to sing it all the time. In fact, I like it so much that I make sure right here in this church, every July, we sing it at least one time. It's Joy to the World. I think that is a fabulous, wonderful message that ought to be sung all year long. Anyway, I am just interested in our message for this evening. I hope you have already started signing up and getting ready for next week's series. It actually starts at the end of this week on Friday evening. We'll finish out this series on archaeology on Thursday and kick right into another series on Friday night. Now, I do need to clear up a little something here. On the brochure, it says begins Friday, September 14 at 7 p.m. We are going to have a 4:30 meeting on Friday and Saturday afternoons, okay? Because that's just a very heavy time. The weekends are a time when a lot of people are off from work and can come, and it's easier for some people. So we're going to have a 4:30 meeting on Friday and Saturday afternoon. So make a note of that. Be sure and sign up, and we appreciate all of you coming. Yes. Oh, well, sure. Let's sing one stanza of it. We'll get ready for Christmas here. We'll sing one stanza, Joy to the World. I believe it's 125 in those books that are right there. But everybody knows the first stanza of Joy to the World. That's okay. Let's do one stanza of it real quick. Thank you, Erica. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. Thank you, Erica. Turn to somebody next to you and say, with the Lord's help, you sounded pretty good on that song. Would you do that for me? Very, very good. All right, listen, I need the help of a young person, and I'll let you define what young person is. Do we have a helper? Oh, well, here's a hand. Come up here. Come up here. Yes. Where is this one? Is this for today? Okay, we'll get that at the end. That's for next. Come here. Close your eyes. You know what? You're getting so tall. Close your eyes. All right. Okay, can you read it? You can't read it? Last name is Johnson. Don Johnson? Who is it? Everybody, if your last name is, no, that's Jameson. Come right up here, sir. I got to see if this is your name. You know what? Even if it's not, come on up here. Thank you. We're not going to have you come up here without you getting something. That's you, isn't it? Trust me, it's you. Come on up. Come on up here. It's you. Come up here. He's got something for you right here. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yes. Let's have a word of prayer, and then let's turn the time over to Tony. Dear Lord and Father in heaven, we thank you for the joy. We thank you for the joy that we have each day, and it's all because of your wonderful grace that you've lavished upon this earth. We thank you for all those wonderful gifts that we enjoy every single day. The Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. What a beautiful song, a beautiful message. I pray that you'll bless Tony tonight. Bless us all as we are into this study in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I have one question. I asked him if I could ask this question. Are you going to talk about archaeology as to whether or not the Ark of the Covenant will ever be found, or Noah's Ark? I don't want to get too far-fetched here, but if you've got an answer to that, I'd like to know what you think.
Okay, the Ark. Will the Ark be found? What do you think? Well, let's think about Noah's Ark first of all, since that's the older Ark. And just think if you got off of the boat and all the Home Depots and all the Lowe's have been destroyed, what would you do? You'd go back up to the Ark and you'd get wood off the Ark and you'd build your house and your towns and your cities out of it, wouldn't you? That's what I would do. You wouldn't think that, 4,000 years from now or 5,000 years from now, these people are going to need to find the Ark so they can have faith that the flood happened, right? They're not thinking about it that way. So when we look at the Colosseum in Rome, there's a whole section of it missing. You know why it's missing? They're using the stones to build other buildings. So the Pope invented a story that Christians were killed in the Colosseum. There's no evidence that Christians were ever killed in the Colosseum. They're killed at the Circus Maximus down the street. But he invented the story that Christians were killed in the Colosseum, therefore it's a holy place. And that's what preserved the whole Colosseum from the rest of the Colosseum from being destroyed. So probably there's not much left of Noah's Ark, in my opinion. And of course, different people report finding the Ark in different places, which leads me to be a bit more skeptical that they've actually found the Ark. So I'm not the most hopeful in that. Regard to the Ark of the Covenant, a lot of speculation that the Ark of the Covenant, when we talked last night about the Nebuchadnezzar coming down, destroying the temple, that Nebuchadnezzar, before he got there, that Jeremiah maybe took the Ark and hid it or had his secretary hide it. Been different ideas. There was one eager person that lived here in Tennessee that was confident that they had found the Ark of the Covenant underneath the Garden Tomb, or Gordon's Calvary, that we looked at last night. And he found it in a cave under there, and that the blood had come off of Jesus' feet and dripped down onto the mercy seat and made atonement. Number one, my faith doesn't need that kind of literal deal. I don't know about your faith, but my faith doesn't need that kind of literalness. But number two, if you didn't hear it between the lines that I was saying, the Garden Tomb is really an 8th century BC tomb. I know you don't like to hear that if you've been to Jerusalem, because Protestants like the Garden Tomb. I like the Garden Tomb. That's why I said my heart is there, but my head is not. Because we know archaeologically there's a 1st century cemetery and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We know that this is where Hadrian built his Temple to Venus. Now just imagine a Temple to Venus. I was reading a book by Simon Sebag Montefiore, a leader of the Salvation Army, gave to me in England when I was doing meetings several years ago, and called Jerusalem. And there was a little footnote in there, a footnote about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and how that graffiti had been found, graffiti of a boat underneath, down in the bowels of the church in the Armenian chapel. And that this graffiti was actually from the 3rd century. So Hadrian builds this Temple to Venus in the 2nd century. In the 4th century, Helena builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on top of it. But in the 3rd century, it's a pagan city. And so when the Armenians were digging down in the bowels of the church to make a new chapel to, I think it's Valerian, the guy who brought Christianity to Armenia, they became the first Christian nation. They're down in the bowels of that, doing that, and they find this graffiti. Now, I thought it was a little tiny graffiti. So several years ago, my wife and I were there before our filming or tours or whatever. We were there early. So I went down to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on 3 occasions. Finally, on the 3rd occasion, I met the Archdean of the Armenian Church of the Holy Land, and Balian. And so I asked him about this. I said, I understand that down in your chapel that you found this graffiti. And he said, where'd you hear that? I said, it was in the footnote of a book by Simon Sebag Montefiore called Jerusalem. And he says, well, that's true. And I said, is there any chance you could take us down to see that? So he said he had finished his religious services. He said, okay, yeah, I'll do that. So he takes us down. It's all under lock and key, and you go down. I'll see if I can, if you remind me, I'll try and put a picture of it up on Thursday. It's about this big. There's actually a boat with a broken mast, with the graffiti from the psalm saying, Lord, we have come. So here was a Christian who snuck in underneath the pagan temple of Venus, drew a picture of the boat he was on with a broken mast saying, Lord, it was a rough trip. Lord, we have come up to Jerusalem to honor you. So just a little kind of a cool little evidence that Christians were coming, even when it's a pagan temple, to honor that site because they believe that's where Jesus was crucified. Now later on, the garden tomb comes along and people get kind of emotional about that, and I understand that. But archaeologically, it doesn't fit. It's an 8th century BC tomb. It's a whole different style of tomb. But heart-wise, I prefer that because there's the other. So I discount what Ron Wyatt says about that. I think he's wrong. I think that all archaeologists that I know think he's wrong because, the evidence isn't that way. Others believe that it was put on Mount Nebo. Some, Bill Shea, my mentor, believed that it was down around Kadesh Barnea, that he took it down that way. There have been some other instances where they took some special kind of instruments to read under the ground into caves to try and find the ark, and just created a lot of controversy. So maybe it will be turned up. I know that some people think about the law of God being revealed at the proper time. I'm not sure that means the Ark of the Covenant will be found. And so I'll leave it at that. Let me say one word about the little sign-up sheet here. If you're planning to come to the series, you can pre-register, and it helps us to know so that we can prepare materials for you. So if you got one of these sheets, if you didn't get one of the sheets, please fill one out. If you're planning to come, and put 4:30 or 7, just so we know how to plan. And you can turn that in at the table or the end of the meeting. You can turn in how you'd like to, and they'll try and circulate that around. So this evening, we want to talk about Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. And let me just kind of tell you a little bit of where we're going. I think we're going to need fresh batteries. I think they're AAA, two. So I'll keep talking until we get that, because it will make my life much easier, as you can imagine. So tomorrow we don't have a meeting, but on Thursday we're going to complete this. So this is kind of a 2-part meeting. We're looking at the world into which Jesus was born. And then on Thursday, we'll look at the rest of the story, you might say, the rest of the life of Jesus story. And then on Friday, we start the Footsteps of Jesus. That'll be a little different format. We have beautiful study guides for it. And so we have beautiful study guides like this. This is why we're wanting you to register. And so you'll get volume 1. And we just want to make sure that we plan appropriately. And so this will involve study guides, and there's Bible studies to do with it, and it's a real special experience. There is a brochure that goes with that as well, so you can be with us. We'll see if I can make our slides advance now. So we have Thursday evening with the Footsteps of Jesus, and then we'll have this series starting on Friday. And there'll be 7 that I will do here, and then the pastors will start volume 2 after I leave and head to Egypt. And so I'll be in Egypt when you do volume 2. And so this will be a very special series. I think you'll love it. We had 7 one-month film trips over a 4-year period filming this. We filmed in lots of different places. Some of you see my footsteps of Paul and told me that. Paul was very easy to film because you go to Ephesus and you do an episode in one day. You go to Athens and you do an episode. Jesus doesn't go very far. So to make it really interesting, I mean, how many angles of the Sea of Galilee can you use before you kind of use up the Sea of Galilee? So it took a lot of effort and energy to try and find interesting locations to do. You can kind of see what it's like filming on location. And so God blessed, over a 4-year period, we were able to get lots and lots of nice areas to be able to share. And so we'll be doing that as we look really kind of at the focus on the early life of Jesus, his early years and ministry in Galilee. And then the pastors will begin volume 2, Jesus in Galilee, and a wonderful series. Just a little note on our tour. Some of you have asked about our tours. We do Egypt. I know this one's coming right up on top of us. We'll actually leave here and go to Egypt. What day is today? Tuesday. We go 2 weeks from today. We'll be flying over and do filming for 3 or 4 days, and then start our tour on the October the 1st. So we don't know if we'll be offering this tour every year or not, but we got really excited about Egypt as we were filming the patriarchs' lives and got down into some of the wonderful stories, and we're hoping to release that series, Footsteps of the Patriarchs, or it's called The World of the Patriarchs. Hopefully by Christmas or New Year's that will be available. And then each spring we do Footsteps of Jesus tours. So we do 2 weeks in Israel and 3 or 4 days in Jordan each year. And this next year will be April 14 to May 1. And so if you're interested in that, there's some brochures outside, and I think some here on the front as well, or you can go on the website and look at it. But tonight we want to talk about Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. And some of this is drawn from a new series that we pitching to the History and Discovery channels, commercial television, that we're calling Mysteries of the Fifth Gospel. And the first episode is Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. So let's begin by looking at the life of Abraham. Abraham lived in Ur. Here we have Ur over here. This is the Persian Gulf. This is the Tigris River, Euphrates River. They come together. And this is the land between the rivers, or Mesopotamia. We've kind of filled this in with green to let you see where the Fertile Crescent is. And so there's a Fertile Crescent going up between the rivers, around the Syrian desert, not including the high mountains. It's unproductive. And then coming down through modern Syria and Lebanon and Israel and the West Bank and Gaza down into Egypt. This was a little fertile strip of land throughout time, and so it's been highly desired. This is a whole desert area. There's one little town out here in the middle that you could trim off 600 miles from your trip by going through this place. It was in the news, unfortunately, recently, called Palmyra or Tadmor. You might have recalled that ISIS blew up some temples out there. The second largest Roman temple in the world was here, and this was the second richest city in the Roman world. And so quite a wonderful place. But anyway, Abram lived down in Ur. In Abram's day, the Persian Gulf came all the way up, so Ur was actually on the coast of the Persian Gulf. They were traders. They did trade as far away as Afghanistan for lapis lazuli. They actually did trade over with Lebanon for the cedars. And so they were a big trading area. This was one of the dominant empires. So you had a big empire here in Mesopotamia. Sometimes it would be Ur, sometimes it was Babylon, sometimes Uruk, sometimes it was Syria, Nineveh. The Assyrians came up from here. And so they would come over and dominate all these parts of the world. So there were multiple empires throughout time that were here. And then there's the empire of Egypt over here. And so they were kind of going back and forth. And you can kind of see that this is an important land between these two areas. So Abram lived in Ur, and he was called by the Lord to go to a land of promise. So Abram left Ur, went up by Babylon. He's following the road. This is kind of the way the trail goes. He deviates and goes up to Haran, and there his father Terah dies. And then Abram leaves Haran, goes down through Aleppo and Ebla, down to Damascus, down to Sukkoth, and then he goes over to Shechem and then up and down the ridge. And this will become Abraham's primary range. He'll range from the north to the south, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in our program. So Abram kind of moves from here over here and kind of does a reverse. At this time, there's a downturn in the economy. This whole area is collapsed, and people are going this way. But Abram kind of reverses the trend and comes this way. And this Haran is very interesting because there's a place called Sanlu Urfa, and this is where Muslims believe Abram lived, and they believe it was that he was there. They believe Nimrod lived there. There's a big confrontation between Nimrod and Abraham, and anyway, it's kind of a bit far-fetched in my opinion. But this is where they believe it happened up here, Sanlu Urfa, that was Ur. But most Christian scholars and Jewish scholars would take Ur of the Chaldees being down here, this very wealthy, advanced city where where they were able to write and do commerce and so on, that this would be the home of Abraham. So God calls him to come to the land of promise. So this gets the land, the promised land, or the land of promise. It'll have some other names. Now here again we can see our Fertile Crescent. I've kind of colored it in a little bit more here so you can kind of see it. And it kind of comes down, gets pretty narrow here in the Sinai, and then we have the land of Egypt here. So we have our two great empires. So it's known as the land of Canaan. Why is it called Canaan? Because the Canaanites lived there, of course. Yeah, that's right. Canaanites lived there, but why? What does Canaan mean? Canaan means red purple. Red purple. You see, it's right on the coast. Right along the coast was the land of Canaan. And so they would dive in the sea for the murex shell, a sea snail. They would take the gland, extract the gland, smash the gland, and they would make purple dye. Because of this, it was very expensive, and only royalty could afford to wear purple. That's why that was the color of royalty. Now, some of you are thinking, well, what about that lady in the Bible who's a seller of purple? What was her name? Lydia. Where was she from? Thyatira. And if you look, Thyatira's inland. It's not near the sea, so how could they be doing that? Well, the inventive people of Thyatira developed a cheaper way of making purple, and the more easier way, they took the madder root, and they would extract purple dye from the madder root. Now, some of you are as old as I am, and you remember back in the late 60s, early 70s, we had bleeding Madras pants. Remember, from India? And you had to wash them, and the purple would just go all over all the clothes. That's why they were bleeding, I guess, from the madder root, but not as quality as that from the murex shell. And so the Canaanites. So why is it called Palestine? Palestine. Other than the Palestinians living there. So last night we talked about how that Hadrian shuts down the Jewish people from going into Jerusalem, bans them from going to Jerusalem, changes the name from Judea to the Roman province of Palestinia in honor of the Philistines. So let me just pause and say something about the Philistines. There's two groups of Philistines in our Bible. There's a group in Abraham's day that are called Philistines, and they're different than the Philistines that David deals with. The Philistines that David deals with, we call them the sea people. We believe they came from Crete. They come in, they inhabit the land. They're actually conquering, going all the way down into Egypt, and Egypt's able to fight them off, and we see a whole lot of stuff in the Egyptian text about their battles with the sea people, okay? But they're kind of turned away. And so these sea people from Crete tended to be taller than the locals, and so they also had iron, and so they brought that with them, and so they dominated the Israelites. And so the Philistine kind of dominate right along the coast. So when the children of Israel come in, they tend to take the highlands here, and the Canaanites have the lowland cities, and then the Philistines take over the Canaanite cities. And that's kind of the way it plays out. It's also known as the Holy Land. I'll tell you, my bias is I don't think there's much holy there. I think it's one of the more graceless places on earth. Unfortunately, Jewish people do not understand grace. Muslims do not understand grace. Islam means to submit. It's all about submitting and doing the will of Allah. And many Christians in that part of the world do not understand grace. So I have to tell you that I always look forward to getting off the plane back in this country. Because whether we're a Christian nation or a post-Christian nation, we live in the memory of being a Christian nation and having grace. And what do I mean by that? If you're at the grocery store and you got a whole big shopping cart of groceries and I come up with a water bottle, what do? Please, right? Please. When I'm in that part of the world, it's my spot. When I bump into you, excuse me, it's just these common courtesies seem to be missing to me. So I always look forward to getting back home, to be honest. I love being there, but I love being back. So I like to call it the Bible land because it's where the story of the Bible took place. So we want to explore some of this evening and look at it a little bit in a deeper way. So we look at the family of Jacob. Jacob's family, they leave and they come down and they come into Egypt. Now here's Memphis down here. This is kind of the capital where many of the things are. You can see the branches. There's 2 branches today of the Nile that you can navigate out to the Mediterranean. But in biblical times, in Jacob's day, there were 5 branches. And there was a Pelusiac branch that came over here, and this was where the people that coming from Canaan would reside, and this is where they had a palace. The Hebrews had a palace. I'm sorry. This is where the Pharaohs had a palace. It's where the Hyksos had their palace, and this would be Goshen right over in here. At a place called Avaris, it's called Tel El Daba today, and next to it would be Tanis. Whenever that kind of dried up, they built over in Tanis, so Ramses the Great, his palace would be over there. They also had palaces at Memphis, and then later on they had their palaces down below. You can see there's routes. This is the route called the Way of the Sea, the Via Maris, also called the Way of Horus, or the Way of the Philistines. And the Bible says the children of Israel did not go this way when they left the land because they didn't want to have to confront all of the Egyptians on the highway and the pharaohs and their armies on the highway. The patriarchs tended to go the way of Shur, and then they'd come into Beersheba and go up to Hebron, or sometimes they go around and come up through Jordan over here. And they do the family of Jacob comes this way actually, and then goes around so that Jacob's family, Esau's family can mourn the loss of Jacob. Very interesting. And there's a southern route of Arabia. Just so we have the map up here, we can see the spice route coming across and the King's Way coming here, and Petra was right here at this crossroads. And so the spice route would also go across to Gaza, and here you could ship your product on the Mediterranean Sea. So Jacob's family comes down to live here in Goshen, in this area. This is where the Hyksos had been as well. And while he's there, the promise is as they're about to go back that God will take them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now it's very interesting as we were working on the patriarchs and did a little deeper dive that they're at Kadesh Barnea, and the complaints, I believe it was Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, they're complaining saying, "You took us from a land flowing with milk and honey out into this desert to die. So you're going to land flowing with milk and honey, but you took us from a land flowing with milk and honey because, again, most fertile land in the world is where they had been living here in Goshen. But the promise is to take them to this land flowing with milk and honey. So let's look at it. Most visitors, when they get there for the first time, are very surprised. I thought my wife would lose her faith because she had grown up reading Bible storybooks like you did and seeing pictures of very fertile areas. And you get there, and this is what you see. And these are nice pictures. They're not bad pictures. I could give you some really desolate-looking stuff. And you say, that doesn't look like a land flowing with milk and honey. It looks like a bunch of rocks. And here they're making terraces and so on for their olive trees. But this is what the land is really like. There's a few nice plains here and there, but most of the area is like this or even worse. And so people get there and say, what? This is not a land flowing with milk and honey. What is going on? And so there are some nice plains. This is above the Jezreel Valley. Jezreel means God sows in this valley. It's very, very productive, but very narrow, very limited. And we ask the question, land flowing with milk and honey. So I ask the question, where do you get milk from? Where did they get milk from? Goats. So it's a land for raising goats or grazing goats. A little bit different. You know, when you cows, you need to be in Tennessee or North Carolina, right? But goats can live on anything. Goats and sheep, they can just scrub out and kind of live on all this scrub land and so on. and forage, and they get by pretty good. So they got their milk from goats. So a land for grazing goats. You have to have a lot of flowers to have enough pollen for the bees to make honey, right? Interesting thing is they didn't cultivate bees in Old Testament times, but they did grow grapes. And they would take the grapes and they'd boil the grapes down into a thick paste called dibs or dibbis. That's the Arabic word for honey. I can take you into the old city of Jerusalem when we saw that nice spice shop last night, and they'll have on the shelf grape honey. They spell it G-R-A-P space H-U-N-Y, grap honey, right? But they'll boil it down, it takes 3 or 4 days, and this is actually honey. Christians through the centuries would actually use the dibs or the grape honey to reconstitute and make grape juice for communion. Okay? So it's really a land for raising goats, grazing goats, and growing grapes, much like Southern California and not like Tennessee. The problem is we read our world into the biblical text instead of letting the biblical text tell us what's going on. And then we get disappointed when it doesn't look like what we think it should look like. And so there's an interesting text here, Deuteronomy chapter 11. The land you are entering to take is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. Isn't that pretty cool? You plant your seed and you just kind of direct the water. Waters it. It doesn't rain, as we said. And it's the most fertile land on earth. Goes on to say, the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. So a very different world. A world that's not dependent upon rivers coming through for irrigation, but one that's dependent upon rain. Is that good? Yeah, unless there's a drought. And where do you go when there's a famine? Down to Egypt, because there's a source of water coming up, right? You get the point? And so when the children of Israel come into this land, it's really good because it's fertile without irrigation. Now listen, the climate, very interesting. Jerusalem receives as much precipitation as London, England. But all of Jerusalem's precipitation is going to come between October and April. Early and latter rain. It's a Mediterranean climate. It's not going to rain all summer long. So it's fertile, but it's a little different. So how do they get by? How do the grapes grow without irrigation if it doesn't rain all summer? Dew. Down in Gaza over here, 250, 60 nights of dew every year. Up here in the north at Haifa, 150 nights of dew. The dew is sufficient to make the grapes swell and the dates grow and the olives grow. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, dew was a curse, right? We're walking with our tennis shoes going to school, and what happens? Feet got wet, our socks got wet. We had wet feet when we got to school, right? Dew. But here's the difference between life and desert. Life and desert. So it's pretty good as long as the rain comes. When the rain doesn't come, then it's a problem. Now, when we're working on the series, my lovely wife that you met, Helen, she's asking me, well, why do they keep going after this Baal? Why do they keep going after Asher? What's wrong with these? What's wrong with these? Now just imagine when they come into the land, they can't take the big cities. I'm sorry. Scratch that because they're recording. They don't take the big cities. Not that they can't. They don't take the big cities because the Canaanites are there. The Bible actually says you're not strong enough or numerous enough to take them. And so they take the hill country. They take the less desirable places. So they're looking down and they're up on Sand Mountain, let's say, and they're looking down and they're seeing Chattanooga with all the water down there, and life's pretty good. The Canaanites, they've got museums and they've got art museums and, they've got culture and they're doing all of this, and we're scratching out a living over here. And so they look down and they see the Canaanite gods seem to be producing. And what's the Canaanite god's name? What's their primary god? Baal. And what's Baal the god of? Rain and thunder, storms. And what do you need in this part of the world to make a living? You need rain. And Asher's the god of fertility. And they look down and they're prospering. And I'm up here kind of more in the scrubby land. And I'm looking down, and guess what's going to happen over a period of time? I want to think their God's delivering. And so when you get into the weeds of this, and I was amazed, we were doing the story of Gideon for the new series, and the volume 2 is on the conquest. And Gideon, I'd read the story, but I hadn't paid a lot of attention to it. And Gideon goes and he chops down and destroys the altar of Baal and the Asherah, right? Whose Baal altar was it? His father's, okay? His father's. You see, they're blending in this. There's a blending going on, and they're being seduced, I believe, because of the success they see with the Canaanites. And so this is going on. Well, anyway, they're all often getting seduced, and that's what's happening. Well, the first thing that stands out is a small land. We talk about it being from Dan to Beersheba. Any idea how far that is? Dan to Beersheba? It's about 140 miles. It's a small land. Now, we talk about up at Dan, and here we see the Dan stream coming down. We see the water from the springs of Dan. So we talk about from Dan in the north, where it's very, very fertile, down to Beersheba in the south. And Beersheba, you get it down about 8 inches of rain a year, not very much rain at all. So it's 140 miles from Dan to Beersheba, a little bit less than that, slightly larger than the state of Vermont. It's about 35 miles wide, 60 miles in some spots. So it's a very, very small land, about the size of the state of Vermont, as I said. And yet it has snowy mountains, mountain caps in the north. This is Mount Hermon, some 10,000 feet above sea level, and the lowest spot on earth at the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below sea level. So a very small place, but tremendous diversity from north to south. It's an inhospitable climate. It's a beleaguered, doesn't have lots of resources, but this is a land that God brought Abram to and said it was a land of promise. And so we wonder why. Well, we look at our globe and we can immediately see this little spot right here is a land of promise, because here's Asia, here's Mesopotamia over here we were talking about. Over here is the Hittites and Anatolia or modern Turkey. Here's Africa with Egypt coming up. And to go between these two places, you got to go right through there. And then if you want to connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, you're going to come up, and you're going to go up the Gulf of Aqaba, you can go up to Petra, and you're going to go over to Gaza, and you're going to ship your product. So this becomes the crossroads, the international land bridge between the three great continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. This is why God brought Abram from Ur way over here. And so here's a little demo to help you to think about this, and how that we have people coming from these different empires. They've all interested in what's going down in Egypt, or Egypt's wanting to go to Mesopotamia, and they got to march right through that little tiny strip of land the size of Vermont, because all this is desert out here and mountains up here. And so this is why this land was so important. It's why God brought Abram. So here we see the great trunk road, Interstate 95, come right through there, right through the land of Canaan, connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so God plants Abram there in that area. So as the traders are coming through, they hear stories of God's faithfulness. As the warriors come through, they hear stories of God's goodness. And they take it to the far parts of the earth. And guess what? It's worked. Over 50% of the world trace their roots to the father Abraham, that Bedouin shepherd we talked about last night, who lived in the land of Canaan. And by the way, Jesus leaves Nazareth, and he comes down, and he lives right here in Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, because Interstate 95, the Via Maris, the way of the sea, goes right through there, and he wants them to pick up the stories and take them out to the far parts of the earth. And so it is an important area because of that. We have this secondary road, the King's Way we talked about, that kind of connected down to the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aqaba. So again, we kind of look at this and we say, wow, this is kind of a scrubby land. I wonder what's going on. These terraces, very important, by the way, almost looks like a ladder, doesn't it? Because this is right at Bethel, and maybe this was in the back of Jacob's mind, almost looks like a ladder going up, and he saw a ladder there. So here we can kind of see some of the forest, and again, mostly olive trees, very good for olives, and making olive oil, and we'll talk about that in the Jesus series and how important that was. Well, there's 4 distinct areas that I want to talk to you about the land. The first area we want to look at is the coastal plain. It runs from Gaza up, He gets to this point, it's got to go around. That's why the road goes in, because there's a piece of limestone mountain that runs all the way out to the sea. Mount Carmel goes all the way out to the sea. And so the road goes in here at Megiddo. That's why Megiddo's on the map. There's a crossroads coming here, very important area. And then, again, the plain goes right on up through this area. So very fertile along the coast. And this is where the main plains were. There's a Jezreel Valley coming through here, connecting Megiddo and Bet-Shan. And that's where another major road would go through this area. But this was very, very fertile, the lowlands. There's also the Shephelah that goes up to about 1,000 feet, the lowlands. This is where the grain would be. And of course, if you look, this is where Gaza and Ashkelon, all these kind of Philistine cities were located, because the Israelites tended to be more here in the hills and not in these areas. As a matter of fact, Dan gets this piece of land over here where Tel Aviv is today, and he can't push the Philistines out. So he goes up and he takes Laish, and it becomes Dan up in the north. So the Carmel Ridge goes all the way out to the sea here, and other than that, this is the lowlands along the area. The central mountain spine runs through these cities like Shechem and Jerusalem and Hebron and Beersheba, and it runs from about 1,500 feet to 3,300 feet. It's limestone mountains, and as I said, there is one piece of it that juts out here to the sea. And so the mountains tends to be where Abram would live, and it tends to be where the Israelites first settled as well. And so kind of a medium area. Up in the north, it gets quite a bit of rain, and so these are flowers in the springtime, way up in the north. And then as you come down, a little bit less rain, a little bit more arid, and very rocky, as you can see. So very hard to plant grain there, so they do more olives. Now here we have around Bethel, where God brought Abram, and he built an altar. But notice all the rocks here, and the thin topsoil, and the soil washes off, goes down into the valleys, and look what they've done. They tend to plow the valleys, right? They plow the valleys and plant their grain there, so they do the best they can with what they have. So again, here we can kind of see some stuff in Bethel as well, different time of year. We go further south past Beersheba, and we're down into the Negev, the dry area. Can't do irrigation, you can't do farming there without irrigation. Shepherds roam around and they find some of the scant grasslands. How they make a living, I don't know. This is the region of Kadesh Barnea. We just filmed this a couple of weeks ago, some time ago in the spring. And very, very hot, very, very desolate. And there are some oases there. And there was an oasis at Kadesh Barnea, and that's why the Israelites were there for over 30 years in that region. We drop down from the central mountains that runs here down into the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is part of the longest, deepest fissure in the Earth's surface. It's a scar over 4,000 miles long, goes from Turkey down to the Great Rift Valley in Kenya, and here it goes into the deepest place on Earth at the Dead Sea. And so this just kind of drops down. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. Jordan River then goes down 65 miles, and now we're at 1,300 feet below sea level. And then gradually it goes back up to sea level as you get down to the Gulf of Aqaba. And so this Jordan Valley, very, very important. Up in the north, we can see the stream. This is called the Dan Stream. It's formed from hundreds of springs that come from the melting snow of Mount Hermon, and it just kind of piles up there. Jordan means descender, and it descends from Dan and goes down. Here's some of the springs. They're just all around. It's really a lovely place to be. This is the Banya Stream. It used to come out of this rock. Now it springs up here, goes over a big waterfall. I love to go hiking down by all of this. And then the Sinor Stream, all three meet here in the Hollow Lake. And then from that, the upper Jordan forms and comes into the Sea of Galilee. This is Bethsaida here, the house of fish. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level, the lowest freshwater lake on earth, and very fertile with the fish, as you can see. And so the Sea of Galilee takes that water in, and so many stories happen around it. Then the Jordan River leaves the Sea of Galilee. It's 65 miles by air to the Dead Sea here, but the river twists and turns over 200 miles. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level, lowest spot on earth, 36% salinity. Comparison, the Great Salt Lake in Utah, 18%. The ocean's 2.5 to 3.5%. So it is so salty that you can really just kind of relax and float around out there, and you lay on top of the water. And quite an experience. I'm sure some of you have done that. If you haven't, they used to say this is one of the most important things in life to do, to see the sea where things float. So here we can kind of see a map, and we can see the ridges. You can see Mount Carmel coming out all the way out to the point here. And so they would go around that, and then the plain would kind of come around. But it's very mountainy, as you can see. This is just trying to show you the Hollow Lake. Used to be a big swamp, and the swamp where the three streams came together was full of malaria. In the early days of Zionism, the Jewish people going back to the land at the end of the 19th century, the Arabs would sell them land there, full of mosquitoes, malaria mosquitoes, and you hear about them dying from malaria and cholera. Sounds like missionaries in Africa, and that's what was happening for the Jewish people who were going back. And today they drained this, and so it's a big agricultural area, but still very important. They found that the birds were being affected by the draining, so they put water back in. So it's a major stop for migratory birds between Europe and Africa and Asia and Africa. And so in the 6th century, there was a place in modern Jordan called Madaba, and it's kind of a corruption, you might say, of Moab. And they were about 2 miles from Mount Nebo, and they built a church, 6th century, okay, 500s. They built this church, and they actually put a map in the floor. They put a map in the floor so that pilgrims coming could see where the Bible sites are. Kind of cool. Well, an earthquake destroys the church in the 8th century. The Ottoman Turks, the Christians are saying, we need a place to build. And they said, well, you had a Christian town called Madaba. You can go there, but you can't build any new buildings. You can just rebuild the old buildings. So they built their houses in the old houses, and they came to this, and they cleaned up the rubble, and look what they found. The oldest map of the Bible lands in existence. And so they find this, and here we can, well, let's see if we can go in a little bit closer and see some stuff. Look at that. We saw that last night. Remember I told you from the oldest map, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here's Jerusalem. There's the Gate of the Column, Cardo going all the way across. You can see the boat on the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River coming down. Here's Jericho, the city of palms. And so many things we've actually found because of this map. Especially in Jerusalem, we could see the Nia Church and different churches, and they were able to locate things based on this because it was what the Christians understood it in the 6th century. Very close, much closer than we are. Now, it's very interesting here. You can see a bridge across the Jordan River, and over here is Bethany beyond the Jordan. And Bethany beyond the Jordan is the baptismal place. So they'd cross the bridge, and then they would come to these springs. When peace broke out between Jordan and Israel, the church said, we want to go down and see what's down there because we think maybe this is where, Bethany beyond the Jordan was. And so they cleaned the mines out, and they went down. They excavated 4 or 5 Christian churches from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, and about 13 baptismal shrines. Prodigious springs were flowing there. And so this is where most likely Jesus was baptized by John, and these springs of the Jordan. They had a piece of the Jordan coming around like this, but there are springs there. Very interesting to go to. The brush is so thick you almost have to crawl under it like this, and because of all the water and the heat, and you almost expect John the Baptist to jump out and tell you to repent. Notice this. Can you see the fish here? See that fish? He's going that way, but look at this fish. What's he doing? He's going the other way because that's the Dead Sea. Nothing can live in it, all right? And so it's all dead. And so very interesting map. So on the other side of the Jordan Valley, we have the Jordan Plateau, also known as Transjordan. And this is the modern Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And it tends to be high, maybe 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet above sea level. And this is even more dramatic because of the depth of the valley here. And so Jordan is very important. In the north, we have Gilead, very forested, mountainy. We come down here in the middle, and we have Moab, and very good for growing grain on the plains. You get down into here, into the Edomite area, and much rougher area, better for minerals and copper and things of that nature. Now, the question we want to ask tonight is, how did the Romans come to be masters of the Holy Land? How did they get there? And to understand that, we need to understand what happens in 139 BC, a very important time in Jewish history. Doesn't mean a lot for us, but for Jewish people it was very important. Remember we talked last night about Antiochus Epiphanes and how he wanted everybody in his realm to worship one God, Olympian Zeus. And he sent out emissaries all through his realm, and said, you're going to sacrifice to Olympian Zeus. You're going to sacrifice what kind of an animal? A pig. So they go to the Samaritans and they do it. They sacrifice a pig. They come down to the temple and Matthias says, I'm not going to sacrifice that pig. And this other Jewish priest says, I'll sacrifice. Matthias takes the sword and kills the emissary and kills the other priest, gets his 5 boys, runs into the desert. They start hammering the folks, the Seleucians that are out of Antioch, the Greeks, and they start hammering them. And finally, in 139 BC, they're rid of foreign occupiers for the first time since Daniel in 605 BC with Nebuchadnezzar. So almost 500 years have passed. Can you imagine how big that is in Jewish thinking? Doesn't do much for you, but really huge in Jewish thinking. And so they have this war of liberation. And in their war of liberation, they have to rededicate the temple, and so they have a feast of dedication. So you read about a feast of dedication in the Gospel of John. Jesus participates in that. It's a wintertime feast. And Hanukkah grows out of that. Now, I don't think Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, but he certainly celebrated the feast of dedication, of rededicating the temple after this major catastrophic event had happened, and then the liberation. So the Jews are pretty happy after this. They're free, and things are going pretty well until Queen Salome dies, and she leaves 2 boys. They found what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, and they're priest kings, and Salome dies, and her 2 boys are left, and the older boy's a little slow. The younger boy's a little more militaristic and a little more, executive ability. And so the older boy becomes the king, and he sides with this guy, Antipater. Antipater is the governor of Idumea. Now, Idumea is important because, remember, there was a crossroad that came over from Petra to Gaza, and he maintains that route, and he makes all of his money in doing the servicing of caravans going out to the Mediterranean from Petra and from on this whole caravan route. And so he sides with the older guy, and so now he's out of power. So what's he going to do? Here we can kind of see our Petra and our routes and so on. He makes all of his money doing this. Now, he's important, as you're going to see in just a moment. And so he invites Pompey Magnus, we know him as Pompey the Great, to come down. He just conquered Syria in 64 BC, to come down and settle the dispute. So for the first time, the Romans are invited to come into the Holy Land. They come down and they settle the dispute for the older brother, which makes Antipater the power broker because the older brother's a little slow, so he's the one calling the shots. 15 years later, Julius Caesar's down meeting Cleopatra, and they're getting together. And remember, Cleopatra's not a real Egyptian. She's she's Greek, right? She came from Alexander the Great in that group. She's a Ptolemy. She comes from Ptolemy. And so the Egyptians turn on her and Julius Caesar. They've got them backed against the Mediterranean. Who comes to the rescue? Antipater. He rescues Julius Caesar. Can you imagine? Julius Caesar's pretty impressed. And so Julius Caesar makes him the procurator of the land. Now, where do you read that? Who else becomes a procurator of the land? How about Pontius Pilate? He makes him the ruler of the land. And so he appoints his son Fazel as the ruler of Judea, and he appoints his other son Herod as the ruler of Galilee. And so this is how the family of Herod gets into power. They're Edomites. They are not Jewish. They were forced to convert to Judaism during a time of this Jewish expansion under John Hyrcanus, but they are not really Jewish. Well, people are chafing at that. They don't like these Edomites ruling, and so they poison Antipater. They assassinate him. A civil war develops. And so they capture Fazel. Actually, what happens is the Persians, they're called Parthians, they come down, they get involved, and they capture Fazel. They put him in jail. He doesn't want to be shown off as a prisoner of war. He beats his head against the wall until he commits suicide. They say to Herod, we'll take care of you. Herod says, not a chance. He gets his family, heads out, escapes the war, heads down to a fortress down by the Dead Sea in his home territory of Idumea. Yes, Masada means fortress. This was an old Hasmonean fortress. Herod comes down here. He puts his family on top of this. Along the way, he's racing along. His mother, Kypros, is in a chariot. She flips her chariot. He thinks she's been killed. He's in such despair, he starts to commit suicide. And they said, no, she's alive. Don't kill yourself. And he goes on down, leaves them there. And the Parthians chase them, and they come down to the bottom of this, but it's such an incredible fortress. There's food, there's water. They can't climb up, and so they're safe here on the top of Masada. Now, here's where the Romans built this ramp. That's the later thing that's going to take place, but this is what we're talking about now. You can see the Dead Sea behind it, so it's right above the Dead Sea down in Idumea. And so what does Herod do? Well, Herod's holed up at Masada. He knows he can't stay there, and so Herod decides that he's going to take and have to go on a journey. So he leaves, goes down through Petra. They won't help him there. Goes over here, comes to Alexandria and asks Cleopatra to help him. Cleopatra puts him on a ship and sends him across the Mediterranean to Rome. He comes to see Mark Antony, and he says, listen, I'm engaged to a Hasmonean princess. Her brother, we should make him the high priest, and he can be the king. Mark Antony says, I don't know. He goes and talks to Octavian, and he says to Octavian, we need to make Herod the king. He's ruthless. Within a week, the Roman Senate has voted to make Herod the Great king of the Jews, even though he's not Jewish and he's not royal. They vote him as king of the Jews, and within a week, he's headed back as king of the Jews. Now, you can imagine that the people don't like this very much because he's not Jewish, he's not royal, and now he's in charge of everything. This is not right. Is God for us or God against us, right? They're kind of putting the whole thing on God out here, right? Are you for us or against us, God? This is terrible. So they chafe at this. So there's zealots. And these zealots, they hold up here. He kind of mops up everybody, but one group of the Taliban or the ISIS of the day, they come up into these cliffs and they hide in these caves. You can see that later on they actually built fortresses in these places. Look at that. But they came up here and they hide in here, and they're going out and they're doing mischief on Herod's guys. They're going back up and hiding in these caves. You can see it going back and forth, seesawing back and forth. And Herod can't do anything about it. And Josephus describes this. It's kind of fascinating. He describes how these zealots are holding up there, and Herod's powerless to do anything about it. And so he studies the situation and thinks, what can I do? What can I do? And so Josephus describes, look at the sheer cliff here. Josephus describes how that the cliff was so straight that they couldn't climb down from the top. It was too steep. If they tried to climb up from the bottom, all they do is push boulders out and kill them. So what were they going to do? So Josephus describes how that Herod built a machine and put the machine out over the edge with chains, and then dropped the chains, had a basket, a crib he called it, and dropped that down in front of these caves, and they used grappling poles to get the people out and fish them out and throw them to their death down below. And this is kind of what it looked like. And there's a grappling pole, and that's what they did. And he wiped out his enemies, and there's now no resistance, and he's able to go down and save his family in Masada. They've been there for a couple of years now, and they had almost gotten caught because they ran out of water, and his brother thought he was going to have to race off to try and get water somewhere for them, and there was a thunderstorm, and they were saved. So this made Herod super paranoid. So you see these? See all these holes? Size of buses. These are all cisterns. So Herod took the water. There's not much rain down there, but when it comes, it's a flash flood, and he guided it. And when the rains would come, it would be channeled and fill up all of these cisterns the size of buses on the side of the mountain. He had them all around so he could have water in case of an emergency. He could flee to this fortress and be safe. And that's exactly what he did. Up on the top, they would bring the water up. Look how big this cavern is, this cistern that I'm walking in. Huge. And they'd fill that up so they have water up on the top, and it was an incredible deal. Here you can kind of see the northern part of Masada. There's actually 3 palaces, 1 here, 2, 3. This is his personal palace, and it's kind of neat to go down and look at. You can, we'll pull away and try and give you a little shot of that. And so this is where you'd be away from the harsh sun, and you'd also get the afternoon breeze. And so a pretty special spot to be able to go to. And when we go up and look at it, we see that the palace, they've colored some of this, but look at this. These are the original colors from the time of Herod in the fresco. So over 2,000 years old, they're covered by rubble and away from the sun, and so they still have that beautiful color. This is part of his baths, and the baths still had the color as well, as it was covered by rubble. And of course, this would be the place where the zealots would come after they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They took refuge here, and the Romans came, the 10th Legion with Titus, to wipe them out. He sent his 10th Legion here under, this was actually the camp of Sylvia. Flavius Sylvia was based here. There were 8 camps. They had a 9-foot wall. You can see it going all the way around Masada with all these camps for one purpose of routing out those zealots. Herod is so paranoid, this is Masada, he builds fortress palaces so he's never more than a day's journey, no matter what might happen. And so he has all these fortress palaces all around. Here's his palace over in Jordan. This is the east side of the Dead Sea. It's called Macarius, and had big towers all around it. This, by the way, is where John the Baptist would be beheaded by Antipas, Herod's son, here in this palace right here. And so Herod had a palace here at Jericho called Kypros, and he would be able to get away and go up to that little mountaintop. He had also palaces down below, but that was his fortress palace. He built Caesarea by the sea. The Israeli symphony plays here. And then Herod had his villa down by the water, as we can see right here. The Apostle Paul, by the way, would be held in house arrest or prison for 2 years here. This is where Herod's palace would be, and his little swimming pools and so on. And then, of course, he rebuilt the temple. That was his crowning work. We talked about that last night, so we won't comment on it now. But he rebuilt the temple. That was really the crowning work. He also built the cave of Machpelah. This is the only building of Herod still standing. It's over the cave of the patriarchs, as we talked about last evening, and quite an important building and place to go and see. So Herod's an incredible builder, but he's not Jewish. Can you imagine the rabbis chafing at this? Can you imagine how it irritates? He's not royal, not Jewish. Edomite, Jacob's brother. Esau is our ruler. I just want to tell you, the most glorious time in Jewish history is this time. Don't stone me, but it's true. It's this time. He takes it, this is the zenith of Jewish history, and the rabbis will not say a word about it. If you talk with Jewish people in Israel that grow up there, they don't know anything about it. Why? Because he's a foreigner. His dad was a Gentile and had to convert over. He's not a pure Jew. And so for them, it's a time of shame. Can you imagine at Passover what they're talking about? They're looking for, some people talk about the time of the end. Well, these people are looking for deliverance, right? And Passover gets all the emotions worked up. This is the time. Can you just imagine? God's going to do it. And so the Romans, Passover comes and they're chafing. We got to get rid of it. We got to kill. That's why the zealots go out with these little swords and start killing Romans and collaborators with Rome. There's agitation like crazy in this world in resistance to Herod and his family and what they're doing and ruling. And you can just imagine. And this is the world into which Jesus was born. This unsettled world. And so Jesus is born here in Bethlehem. Now it's interesting, Bethlehem means house of bread or house of the baker. Isn't it appropriate? Jesus is the bread of life, born in the house of the baker. It was about 5 miles from Jerusalem on a ridge of limestone, just a couple hundred people, a little tiny place. But Jesus was born there, and we read in the Bible about how that Joseph and Mary went down to register in this place and in the town of Bethlehem, and Jesus is born here. Here's something very interesting. We were filming part of the series that we start on Friday night, and I talked about how life begins in the cave. You start out in the cave, and as you make a little money, you build in front of or on top of your cave. And we looked across this valley and looked outside what we saw. Can you see the cave here? Look at that. You can see the cave. You can see they built in here, and then they built a house on top of it, and they actually have an upper room on top of that. And you know what they have down in the lower area now? That's where they bring their animals in, and guess what they have? A manger. Because a manger is just a feeding trough for your animals. Every house has one. Now, we know a manger's like this because, most of us are European descent, and, and in Germany and in England, they got all kind of forests. There's no forest over here to speak of. It's all stone. So this is what mangers were like in Jesus' day. Out of stone, they'd be in the house. These are mangers at Megiddo that they use for the horses because everything is stone there. And so don't stone me, please. Here we can kind of see a close-up. Look at this. There's the door of the house. There's a window. And as we were filming, you could actually see a shepherd going in and out of this, all right? But they have their house here, and they actually have a cataluma, an upper room on top of that, a guest room. Very interesting. They even had some modern mangers when I went over and did some filming. Look at that. I have a barrel or metal because it's just a feeding trough or a watering trough. And that's what Jesus was put into when he was born in a cave. Now, this is the Church of the Nativity. This is ground zero for the tourist, the Christian tourist going into Bethlehem. This is the oldest church in the land. Now, the Persians came and they destroyed all the churches in the land, but they didn't destroy this church in the 7th century. Why would they destroy all the churches and leave this church? I'll just tell you this. The Persians came from the east and destroyed all the churches in the land, but they left this church. Why? You may say it again? The Persians came from the east okay, and destroyed all the churches. Why? The wise men. They got there and there were frescoes of the wise men. They said, our guys have been there. We can't destroy this place. And they preserved this place. It wasn't destroyed. Look at this. This is the Byzantine entrance of the original church. Look how tall that is. Isn't that majestic? That was the doors to go into the church commemorating where Jesus was born. Look at this. You can see the Crusader one here, right? The Crusader arch right here. And it's much smaller. But then the Ottomans started riding their horses through and bringing their carts through, and so they had to lower the door again, so now you actually have to bend down to go in, and they call it the door of humility. It's appropriate. You're going to the place where Jesus was born, right? So it kind of puts you in the attitude as you bend down to go into the church. And it's a lovely church. It originally was built by Helena, the mother of Constantine, on a grove to Antony that was planted by Hadrian to desecrate the place where Jesus was born. We can see the part of the old floor here going back actually to the Church of Helena. And when you come up to the front and you go down underneath the altar to the grotto, and in the grotto is this area right here with a Latin star, and this is a spot where most Christians believe that Jesus was born. The star says in Latin, here Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary. And so very, very special spot. Always a skeptic, I'm just pulling that back. You can see it really is a cave that this church had been built over. Probably only a couple hundred people living in Bethlehem, and they lived here. This was a village at that time, desecrated by Hadrian. Well, the wise men do show up. They come at least 40 days after the birth of Jesus, right? Why would we say that? Because he's already been to the temple and been dedicated when he was 40 days old. So they see the star, they make their journey, they come from the east. My favorite picture that I found, this was in the back of a church in Paris, something about the diversity of the wise men and so on, coming and honoring Joseph and Mary. The Bible says, by the way, they're in a house when this takes place. And so Herod, they stop in to see Herod, and nobody seems to know much about this, what's going on. After the wise men leave, Herod interrogates them, the sages, and they say, Micah 5:2, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. They knew, but they were doing disinformation. God had not revealed through them what was going on, and they were trying to do disinformation. Herod, ever paranoid, when the wise men did not return because they'd been warned by an angel not to, he took it out on the families in Bethlehem, and he had all the male children 2 years and younger killed according to what he had seen from the wise men or the visitors, the Magi. And so it was a terrible time, but very, very like his character. Herod had his favorite wife, the Hasmonean Princess Miriam, killed. He had her brother, the high priest, drowned. He had 3 of his own sons killed, 2 by strangulation. So it marks his character well. His friend Caesar Augustus said, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son. Since he wouldn't eat pork, he'd get by a little longer than being a kid in his family, right? Well, from Jerusalem, we can look out and we can see this. Can you see that little volcano-looking thing there? This is what Herod built as his summer palace outside of Bethlehem, just a couple of miles from Bethlehem. He reshaped this mountain with his engineers, perfect size, swimming pool down here, guests would stay here, fortress palace here, and Herod builds this for himself, and here he will be buried in 4 BC. Herod will die. Jesus is not born in 1 BC or 1 AD because Herod dies in 4 BC. And so the Holy Family is told down in Egypt to come back, but they tell him, don't go to Bethlehem because Herod's son Archelaus is there and he's like his father. Go back up to Nazareth. Nazareth comes from the word netzer. Now here's an olive tree. Can you see these sprouts here? Olive trees don't grow from seeds, they grow from sprouts. They come up from the root. You see that? So it reminds us of what Netzer's about. This is a messianic village. Isaiah 11, verse 1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Today in Israel, Christians are called Netzarim. On their identity card, they're called sprouts or Netzarim, okay? Because we're a sprout out of the stump of Jesse. And so here in this Nazareth, it's a little tiny village in Jesus' day, maybe 100, 200 people. And there's a lady there, a young girl, if she's typical, 13 years old probably, and she gets the most amazing announcement. The angel Gabriel comes to her. She's pledged to be married. Takes a year to have that happen. And Gabriel comes and says, do not be afraid, Mary. You've found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus. She ponders that and says, this is wonderful. Probably goes home, tells her mom. Mom says, this is wonderful, and then realizes she's not married, and it's a scandal. Here's this big, beautiful, it's the largest basilica in the Holy Land, built over the earlier Byzantine and Crusader churches that were both built over this cave church from the 2nd century. And so here we see the original homes of Nazareth, 1 to 200 people, little tiny messianic village. And here is one of these homes. Off to the side over here, there's actually a manger in the wall where they would take their animals into the lower level. They had their houses above. So very special to go. When you go right down the street, there's another church called the Church of St. Joseph, or Gabriel, the church, I should say the Church of St. Gabriel. This is where the water source was. When you go down to the grotto, the spring still flows there, and tradition says that this is where Gabriel met Mary. When I see pregnant people, I think about the scandal that Mary created. And so the family says this is a God thing. They share it with Joseph, and he says, I'm not sure about that. And so he says, I'm going to divorce her secretly, quietly, and takes her away from Nazareth to do that. And they go to Bethlehem, and God reveals this is a God thing. And so Joseph marries her. We can see the type of home that Jesus would have grown up in. This is kind of a restoration of a 1st century Nazareth at the Nazareth village, and so it lets us see what life would have been like, sleeping on the hard floor and much of the pottery like we see, a very simple life. That's what Jesus grew up with as a Jewish boy, memorizing the Hebrew scriptures and going to synagogue, learning the family business trade, building trade. Here are the waits for making their coats that they would wear in the day and their blankets at night. And so this is what life would be like. Jesus would learn the family building trade as well. And then when he was 12 years old, they went to Jerusalem. Remember, probably the first time he's been there since his dedication. And this time, he's doing a bar mitzvah, right? Bar is son, mitzvah law, becoming a son of the law, happens to Jewish boys at 12 years of age. He comes and he's being bar mitzvahed. And now that he's a son of the law, Mary must have thought that he's going to stay with Joseph. And so Mary and the other ladies left, and they went down to Jericho and set up camp. And then Joseph must have thought he was helpful with his mom and had gone there. And they all get down there that night to Jericho, and guess what? No Jesus. And they panic because they think about what Herod had done, and they return. But Jericho's 1,000 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, 2,500 feet below sea level. Only 15 miles, but a big, steep climb. Can't go that night. It takes them all the next day. And the 3rd day, they find him in the temple. And you know what he's doing? Questioning the sages, questioning the rabbis. And he's actually leading them from messianic greatness to thinking about messianic sacrifice. The Bible is very simple in what it says. Luke 2, verse 39, they returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Jesus grew up as a simple boy there, Mary teaching him, learning Joseph's building trade, memorizing the scriptures, and learning to depend upon his heavenly Father, following the Spirit. Don't you love it? He grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. He learns all these lessons that he will share in the rest of his ministry. He'll stay here for the next 18 years until he hears the call that we'll talk about tomorrow evening. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you for this time to drift away, examine the land, hear the stories. Oh, wow, we're so amazed, Jesus, to think about what you did, leaving highest heaven and becoming part of Mary, being born in a stable, a cave, placed into a feeding trough that animals would eat from. Incredible. And yet we see this wonderful experience in the temple and just a flash of what will happen and how it's dawning on you what your ministry and your role will be. And oh, Lord, we want to say we love you tonight. We want to know you more intimately and have a deeper relationship with you each and every day. So bless each one of us now as we go from this place, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So tomorrow we'll pick up on that and we'll talk about Jesus' baptism and ministry, and we'll look at all these places and show you lots of pictures. And then on Friday, we'll start the series and we'll look at, as I mentioned, fill out your little card so we can get your study materials together. Footsteps of Jesus on Friday, and then I'll be here for the next week with you doing that. So we thank you for coming tonight. Hope that you are blessed as you go, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. God bless you. Tomorrow. Thursday. I'll be here by myself.